Elves are always a super interesting character, I think. They're more than humans, but they're not as elevated as gods, so they kind of have this really unique middle space, which I think gives us a lot of creative opportunity. This kind of, what you're looking at here kind of shows like the early inception of them. Some pieces that Yefim did where they were going to be more kind of insect uh, kind of inspired, and then kind of more the final one we went to where they're more humanoid. Um, these are two characters I think, again, we didn't want like their costuming and their design to just be like man-made, so you see a lot of natural elements in them. Um, this is something that'd be great to kind of, there's a whole story behind these guys, I feel, too, that we could revisit potentially.
I think this was one of the first ones when the collaboration really started to kick up a lot with the combat guys and what they wanted to test with these guys. And so we had a lot of early revisions when we got together, and some different designers were choosing the ones that they kind of felt like it would work for what they had in mind. That's why we had a lot of early revisions, even the more insect type of character. But then it kind of evolved, even on the environment side of where they live, and a lot of the more insect vibe early on. But then it kind of evolved into something a little more.
I like trying to flip the script on the idea that elves are Orlando Bloom, right? And it's like to be able to look at it and say like, oh, there's inspirations from the sort of traditional understanding of fairies a little bit, as well as then our kind of own take on this idea of both the light elves and the dark elves, so that we could sort of make our own version of it, right?
Yeah.
Instead of feeling like what we're doing is just sort of making pointy-eared guys who, are hunky like Orlando Bloom. And I think we can just, with everything that we've done throughout this entire process, it felt like we were always able to kind of approach each one and say, how would we do it, right? Knowing what the sort of popular culture understanding of it is, how would we approach each of these in order to make something unique, so that when people look at this world, they say, oh, that is Santa Monica's Norse, right? That the same way that people look at the Norse world. Some even say like this is the way Norse mythology was because it's Thor's universe, right? So they all think Chris Hemsworth is Thor, right? Even though he's red-haired in the actual myth.
Yeah.
They all think of him as the blonde hunky guy with the helmet. So I think it's interesting. Hopefully it will be effective and resonate with people.
Yeah, I think the historical reference as well helped a lot on this one. When we start adding a lot of that stuff, like this has a lot of the tribal influence that we selected early on. That's when I think it kind of starts to resonate with people and make it work. And same thing for the light ones, that it's not in here, but there's a lot of that contrast when they have a lot more ornate designs and the feeling of more.
And everyone's calling them the dark ones and the light ones. And this was very intentional because early on in the project, when talking about things like elves or fairies or dwarves, everybody had a very knee-jerk D&D reaction. So I made a concerted effort to rename things so that people would get more comfortable with the idea, instead of every time I'd say like, we're going to talk about elves, they'd be like, oh, okay, this God of War, why are we talking about elves, right? So I think it wasn't until like what 2 or 3 years in where it was like, okay, we're gonna change the elf or the light one name now back to light elves, because it seems like everyone's comfortable and we don't have to have the D&D discussion,
Yeah,
right?
I feel like we had to
over
earn
and
it a
over
little
again. But that's quite funny that we have to almost fool ourselves so that we're comfortable with working in the space, instead of constantly going back to the well of Lord of the Rings had elves and this is what they look like.
No, but I actually think that really helps because it kind of breaks us out of a character type that has so much history associated with.
Makes you look at it as a unique thing, as opposed to like the history and the weight that it carries, right? That everybody's like, oh, it's elves and fairies. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, and one thing we did too with this character, and the light one is kind of the counter to the dark ones, even though they're opposing. On first look, we wanted them to feel very drastically, but on second look, you might realize that there's actually some similarities between them, just kind of that they're from the same realm and they do share some kind of history.
They are two sides of the same coin, like they are intrinsically tied together, and just like different human beings wanting to fight each other, they are the same and yet they have conflict.
So looking at the Revenant, just curious about the story behind the design with the lantern, the hay, all the elements that go into it.
I think this one was really like make something different and unique that feels like it's not the witch that you've seen before in different games. So it was a lot of a lot of sketching by Yefim again.
Yeah.
Of just trying to come up with something that feels unique. I feel a lot like Bloodborne also came out like right at the time when we started designing
Yeah,
this.
that was frustrating as hell. Because honestly,
Yeah, a lot
this
of
came.
those
three.
types
The
of-
initial thing with the rake came from an etching that I saw about, sort of medieval Europe when they talked about the plague. They called it pestilence or pesta,
Yeah.
right? And they had it was personified as this like scary old woman with a rake that would come into your village and essentially kill everybody with her breath, right? And it was the way that they sort of made the Black Plague kind of physical, right? And I thought, oh, that's really cool. This concept of pestilence, this old woman with a rake, and the rake, I just kept kind of going back to and feeling like that's so interesting because it's so innocuous. It's like a piece of like yard equipment, right? But it has a kind of sinister vein to it. So she took forever to get right. Like this was something we went back and forth on for quite a long time. Even the upper right hand corner, is that the
more
drummer?
yeah. 'cause
Yeah.
they
That
have
cut
different-
character of the drummer?
Well, the witch or the revenants at the beginning had more variations within them. a lot of
So
them.
they were having like potentially like that drum vibe.
And I think that was even coming kind of like from combat of almost like you couldn't see her, you almost had to follow the sound of the drum.
Yeah.
It was a real cool idea, but sometimes things don't work ultimately for what we need. But
What was the lantern? Did we put the lantern on because we wanted her to be seen easier from a distance? Or was that just like a random sort of art choice that it was like, we just put a lantern on there?
I think it came from the design or one of the first sketches when it just feels the silhouette reads much better with the
Yeah.
lantern. And when we started playing with the variations, that was something that we kept through all of them.
Yeah, and I think another thing we kind of try and do too is we want to make these characters frightening, but avoid going into like the horror side of it. It's kind of like a fine line, but it's very easy to go on that. And I think what Yefim did with this is really kind of hit what we were looking for. Where it's a scary character without being kind of the cliche horror witch.
Yes. Cliche horror, bad.
For these Valkyrie artwork, I'm just really curious about the inspiration, especially it seems like fallen heroes, fallen like soldiers almost. What were some of the inspirational designs that you guys took?
These are done by Justin Sweet and Vance Kovacs, and this is actually one of my more favorite characters in the game. I really love what they did. Again, inspiration came from Corey. I think again, kind of playing against type, he had the idea about the harness as the wings, not going with the natural
Oh, yeah.
set of wings.
So that it's more like a plane captain getting their wings. Like
Yeah.
there's a sort of a graduation. Like you become the shield maiden, the strong warrior, and what you get out of that is the physical wings as kind of like your mark of being a Valkyrie.
Yeah, kind of almost. Yeah, I think one time we were talking about maybe like Odin gifted it to him, or was it very special for them to get it? And
It's a little like the blades,
Yeah.
right? So Odin gives it to him, and it feels like a gift, but honestly, it's more of a sign of servitude.
yeah, and Vance and Justin did these great things where they're almost wearing these death masks, and within those we kind of tried to theme each of them after a different animal, so each one had their own unique design. And I think what came from the wings and the harness also to complement this was a unique gameplay. And what we do with the gameplay is, one, they've got the wings to attack, which is really unique in our character cast, but secondly, where Kratos has the Bifrost and is able to kind of go through realms a little bit, he's kind of learning that magic where these Valkyries have a mastery of it. So even when you attack them, they can kind of almost pull weapons out of different realms. So you may not see them with a sai or a blade, but they'll have it right there. It's like their attacks can switch really fast, which is super unique. And
Yeah, even that we started add a lot of the Bifrost energy and how things act in the universe and pulling stuff from different realms. So all the effects and all that stuff kind of plays up on the same vibe. And the same
Those
thing with
helmets
the
were
wings.
kind of a breakthrough moment.
Yeah.
Like the first one that was done, and we were like, oh my gosh, that's cool. And started to theme them after kind of the cardinal animal of each of the Valkyries. I was like, oh, that to me was like that awakening moment of like, oh, I can really see how these will work. Because all the drawings were really cool, but it's hard to make a Valkyrie that feels like our own.
Yeah.
Because they're so widely understood, and kind of the tenets of what a Valkyrie is are hard to take away. You can't really strip those things away, so you end up having a difficult time distinguishing yourself. But I think we did a pretty good job of that.
that's one thing I like about the mask too, is it takes away the emotion in the face. That's why, like, again, this was like frightening versus horror. That's why sharks are scary to me. You can never tell what they're thinking. It's
Because
just
they wear
like,
masks?
yes, Valkyrie masks. And that's my character concept.
You're like, that's the. I'm gonna pitch that game next. Sharks that wear masks.
That character was also cut, the shark with the mask, but next game.
It's interesting too because as you find out when you play through the game, you understand the connection of Odin to the Valkyrie, and part of those helmets, while they are ornate and they kind of disguise, they also sort of dehumanize, if you will.
Yep.
They take away who the person is underneath, which is kind of, very beneficial for Odin. That's something Odin would want, is to turn them into kind of his soldiers.